times out of 10, I've got a research report hanging out in my Dropbox if you want me to email it to you. I didn't say this at the beginning, but that's one reason I had the email up. I'll also have a YouTube channel that I'll be putting this up on, so if you missed anything or if I didn't talk loud enough, then you know, you'll be able to hear it that way, hopefully.
Welcome to the November meeting of the Rare Fruit Growers. Sorry for the confusion. Angry words will be sent to the San Diego Botanical Garden Foundation tomorrow.
That's beautiful.
So, with no more further ado, we'll have our business portion of the meeting afterwards. But for now, I'd like to introduce Matthew Gates. Matthew is going to be speaking to us tonight about biocontrols for fruiting trees and other plants. So, Matthew, take it away.
Thanks a lot.
Just tell me when.
Oh yes, yeah, when? Okay, cool. So I wanted to start up with, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No. Okay, I'll try to project my voice better. How about now? Better? Okay, just let me know if you don't hear me. I'll try to do better. So I wanted to talk about some IPM fundamentals up front because I never know the experience level of who I'm talking to, and you know, I like to have some advanced information. What's that? Yeah, there you go. Integrated pest management. Everyone, raise your hand if you know what that is. Right, that's good. I'm glad. So integrated pest management, thanks a lot, Ben, is the way that most people try to grow plants nowadays. For the vast majority of for commercial, for residential, and that's the use of biocontrols, it's use of cultural controls, chemical controls, and cultural controls. And I'm missing one, but we'll go over all of them here. Bottom line up front, yeah, I'm right here. Biochemical, cultural, genetic, and mechanical. So biological control makes sense. It's using living organisms to get rid of other living organisms. You've got chemical control. That's both synthetic and naturally occurring. So your azadirachtin as well as your abamectin. And if you don't know what that is, abamectin is an insecticide and miticide that a lot of people are trying to not use as much as a systemic pesticide, if you've heard that phrase before. Avid is an example. He's a couple of different abamectins. And you've got azadirachtin, or the active ingredient in Azamax, which is an extract from a tree. So you got cultural, which are environmental and procedural changes. So like in a commercial setting, maybe you have a particular way that you harvest fruit, and maybe that way that you harvest fruit is by picking it and not snipping it off. And that might damage the fruit, that might damage the tree. Maybe you rip off part of the branch instead of just the part of the petioles that you want to get rid of. And so maybe that introduces pathogens via a wound. So maybe you find that you're dealing with pathogens, and you want to find a way to stop that. And so one thing you can do is change how you do something, and that's a cultural control, and that's usually really helpful. It's usually not very expensive to invest in cultural controls. That makes sense, but you've got to have to know what they are. And so that's when you hire people like myself or other folks who know what some of those things could be. And it's different for every crop. It's different for every grower. You know, sometimes you have to be very unique in how you do what you're doing. You've got genetic, so that's inherent genetic resistances for pathogens and pests. You kind of can't do anything once you got the plant, obviously, but you might grow cultivars that are resistant to a pest or a disease. That makes sense, right? And mechanical, so that's the basic physical methods of control, and that you've got things like just kill them by hand. If you've got a small plant, just go out there and squish them. It's not difficult, but if you're on a commercial setting, that's a little bit harder to do, obviously. Under mechanical, I would also consider things like UV light. So like UV light can kill fungi, and it can also screw with insects as well. Because just like us, UV light at extreme levels over a long period of time is not good for you. And most organisms that have developed to live underneath the sunlight have developed ways to live long enough that that's not a problem. Obviously, if you take a lot of organisms that live in caves and things like that, that's going to, you take them out in the sunlight, some of them will die within minutes. partly that it's that reason, and there's other reasons too, of course. All right, so basically, to give you an example, in IPM, in integrated pest management, you want to use all of those things together. So that could include things like crop scouting. Crop scouting is a thing that is really important in a commercial setting, of course, and also in a residential one if you don't want your plants to die. Just look at your plants weekly, daily, depending on how much you want to. Well, first of all, let me ask this because I want to gear my presentation correctly. How many people here work or operate a commercial grow? Yeah, okay. Most of these people are residential or growing their own plants personally. Perfect. So going out to your plant is really important. Going out, and as one gentleman came up to me before the presentation, showed me his a couple of leaves from some citrus plants, I found a scale insect on them. And so, you know, just that kind of daily or weekly routine of looking at your plants, taking some samples, looking at leaves can be very helpful. If you don't know what that bug is, take it to a UC extension officer or somebody that's literally their job is to help people with that. And I would really, really, really want to iterate to you how important that is, because we have pests that are transferred through the propagation of different plants for crops in commercial settings, and then people will buy them, and then they get a pest that has a very virulent disease. Like, who here knows what citrus greening disease is? Right, and so as you guys who raise your hands know, that's a big problem, and currently there aren't really any great ways to combat it. And what will happen is that those psyllids that can be vectors for that disease, if they get into your residential area, I mean, even if all of the commercial greenhouses and all the commercial crops were to control, if those reservoirs of pests are still not controlled, then they can just hop right back into the commercial setting. You've got millions upon millions of dollars spent trying to deal with this problem. It's a huge economic issue. So please look at your plants, and please, if you find pests that you don't know, find somebody who can identify it for you. If your plants are starting to have problems that might seem like a disease or a pathogen, take it to a UC person, because you might just save the citrus industry, just for an example. So that's crop scouting. It's a big thing. You'll see that says Diglyphus and leaf miner on this graph, this example. In a commercial setting, you would try to track your biologicals versus your pests and see how that fares. Diglyphus is a parasitic wasp, and you can tell that it sort of increases and follows the direction of its pest, its host, the leaf miner, the American serpentine leaf miner in this case. But there's other things, like using biological control, Spidocilius persimilis. You can, if you're like my buddy here, Parabug, he will, you can put out persimilis using a drone. But if you don't have that, you can put them out using your hand. And using Spidocilius persimilis as a predatory mite to kill two-spot spider mite, for example, which is a very common pest, that's very helpful instead of having to use, like I was saying before, abamectin, some sort of miticide or other insecticide agent. You've got trapping, which would be like a mechanical control, yellow sticky cards, things like that. They're also helpful for your crop scouting. You can take what's on the card and evaluate, oh, I'm getting fungus gnats, or oh, I'm getting aphids, or something that blows out on the wind, thrips, or whatever. So that can be very helpful too. And then you've also got things like a mesh barrier, which can be mechanical, using some sort of netting. Really simple things like that can be a great investment so that you don't have to deal with pests in the future. So I'm just going to go through each one of these slides, or each one of the sections of the IPM, each of the 5. Biocontrol, right, I gave you some examples. Here on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see it very well. By the way, am I projecting my voice enough? Can you guys hear me? No, please. Okay. Yes, good. All right, I'll try to project my voice a little bit better. All right, cool. So on the right-hand side, we have mealybug and mealybug destroyer, which is a pretty apt name. It's a ladybug, actually. It's in the ladybug family. And its larvae are actually able to they mimic. They have the same sort of waxy coating that mealybugs and other scale insects have. And they will crawl up right next to a mealybug, they'll detect the wax, and they'll go into a feeding frenzy. And unfortunately for the mealybugs, but fortunately for the person using them, using the mealybug destroyers, the detection of wax, like on their egg sacs, makes them want to reproduce. So, you know, they find that food, and they'll immediately start chomping down. On the right-hand side, there's actually that's a video, but we don't have to activate it. It's Diglyphus, which I mentioned prior. Diglyphus is a parasitoid wasp. A lot of people will use things like parasitoid wasps to control scale insects. There's a ton of them that have adapted to laying eggs inside the scale, because it doesn't move, it just kind of sits in one place and sucks out all the plant juices, so it makes a great target. But there's also organisms like ants that will protect those scale insects, because a lot of scale insects will produce honeydew. And that honeydew is a sugary carbohydrate substance that all kinds of bugs usually don't have access to. And ants will even practice animal husbandry by protecting the scale insects or moving them around when they're juveniles in a way to kind of herd them, which is pretty fascinating. Chemical controls. I really want to touch on this because there's a lot of misinformation about chemical controls. People hear the word chemical and they get really, you know, they sneer and they jeer and they say, oh, chemicals, that's no good. But there's all kinds of chemicals, and you have things that are fungicidal agents like myclophenol, sulfur, and even silver nanoparticles, which if you're interested in that, I can talk to you about more a little bit later. I don't want to get into the details, but there are some really fascinating chemicals that are coming out that aren't necessarily going to be poisonous to people, or they're not going to be necessarily systemic and things like this. But it's definitely true that you don't want to, especially for you guys who are using, who are growing fruit trees, you don't want to use systemic pesticides that'll get into your fruit and then into you. But things like sulfur isn't going to do that. So you just gotta, you can't just assume that because it's a chemical, it's one, synthetic, and two, going to be systemic or translaminar, which means it gets into the leaf material, but it does not travel throughout the entire plant. A systemic pesticide, if it's taken up by the roots, will go all the way up throughout the plant. If it's only translaminar, that means that wherever you spray, the chemical will get into the plant and it'll stay in that area. So that's important for if you're trying to control a pest that's on like roses, for example, some like big old rose bush. If you only spray haphazardly and you only get half of that plant, only half of that plant is going to contain the pesticide, and that pesticide will only stay in the plant for a couple of weeks. It depends on the weather and things like that. What I have? Oh yeah, you got mineral oils. For example, if you're trying to grow fruit trees and not use systemic pesticides, mineral oils, obviously a pesticide, but not something that's going to travel into your plants. They tend to be things that are going to work because they suffocate the pest. They're going to you're just going to suffocate them with the oil. It'll go right over them. Scale insects, which have a waxy coating and are very common in fruit, do not. They're able to brush off, kind of like putting up an umbrella. That waxy coating, just like it'll bead up. The pesticide will and just drop right off. But oils, if you get enough of them, and if you use a surfactant, you might be able to get enough on the insect so that it just suffocates and dies. If you crop scout, you can tell after your application, maybe a week later or something, whether it was effective or not. And at the very end, we've got mitocidal agents, which I bring up, and herbicidal agents like glyphosate. Who has heard of glyphosate? Right. Active ingredient of what? Roundup. Right, there you go. But you've also got sodium chloride, which is salt, just table salt, right? That's gonna kill you some herbs, but you probably don't want to use it in your crop because it'll make the soil not help. Yes. Next one. Cultural controls. I'm just gonna read off the slide, like all my teachers told me not to. But I'm the one who's here talking to all of you. So, environmental modification intended to discourage pest development in the crop. Some common aspects of the environment that may be optimized for pest treatment include Psychrometrics, which is a very fancy word for saying the interaction between humidity and temperature. If you're growing in a greenhouse, how many people are growing in a greenhouse? Like a personal one? Okay, not very many. Having that structure allows you to play with the environment and control it to a small degree. But if you don't have that, then you kind of are just at the whim and mercy of Mother Nature. If it's cold or hot, or if you get a heat wave like we've had a few times in autumn, which is sort of surprising, then you kind of can't do anything about it for the most part. But if you do put up some sort of a control or a structure, a physical barricade, like a netting or something like that, you can influence the humidity inside. If the mesh is really fine, it actually, at that point, prevents some airflow, and you might increase the humidity in that way. Just something to think about. Labor, I'm not going to get into. It's your own labor. You spend it how you would like. Physical construction, I kind of touched on that in my last point. You've got, if you've got a greenhouse, if you've got netting, if you've got a fence, if you've got a tree line, something that will keep pests that are riding on the wind, known as aeroplankton, from coming in. That's thrips, aphids, sometimes male scale insects, because they're the flyers usually. All the females are actually not going to have wings, for example. You've also at the very end got hygiene maintenance, which is going to be applicable to everyone, but especially in a commercial setting where you've got where you've got a.
Pardon me coming up, I'm just kind of deaf.
Oh, it's no problem.
Speak up, Matt.
Thanks. Thanks, Ron. Also, if you've got, if you want to buy some chicken eggs, you can go talk to Ron.
Oh, turkeys too.
And turkeys too, apparently.
Turkey eggs?
Narragansett.
They're bigger than chicken eggs.
That's true.
So are ducks.
But Matt, when you talked about physical construction, you also talked about taking into account like the physical construction of your garden and the different things that you can plant to encourage companion planting and things to bring in other insects, or does that fall into another type of control?
I would probably not characterize it like that, but it is an aspect to consider. I suppose I would consider that maybe even cultural, I suppose. But I'm not sure. That's a good question, actually. I don't really have the answer to that, but that's a good point. You could perhaps, in a residential setting, if you want to have a cover crop, if you want to grow flowers to attract pollinators and things like that, that's an important point to consider. And a lot of times people in a commercial setting are going to balk at that and not waste the time doing that. But there's some really interesting things and really interesting interactions between plants regarding that. But yeah, hygiene maintenance. Not having water pool up in a greenhouse is one of them. Making sure your irrigation is good. In some cases you don't want to overhead irrigate. You don't want to take a watering can and water over the plants, because you might get botrytis, which is a fungus, in your flowers or other sorts of things. You might get, you might also have damping off if you overwater and things like that. Making sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen is important.
Does the hygiene maintenance, because we do a lot of fruit trees and everything, so we do a lot of grafting, would cleaning your tools and everything fall into this category as well?
That would be an excellent
Your
point.
pruners, your grafting.
Having your pruners cleaned, making sure you have a good sterilant, making sure that you're using clean tools, absolutely important. Genetic control, not something you can really do very much about, but there's a ton of interesting things coming out with resistant cultivars, resistant, or even well, yeah, I guess resistant cultivars is the best way to put it. Whether that's modified genetically or whether that's traditional breeding, you've got people who are working tirelessly to keep things like pests and pathogens from infecting your fruit trees and other sorts of plants. That's really all I have for that slide. Mechanical control. Physical controls which disrupt and kill pest organisms in a direct way. They are often simple techniques that are not prone to resistance in target organisms. So like, you really can't get resistance to being squished, for example, right?
Not yet.
Trapping. Removal. So like if you just got one leaf that's got a bunch of scale and nothing else, hey, just clip it off. You don't need to spray something. You don't have to spend the money to spray it. You don't have to spend the money to buy the product. You just clip it off. So sometimes you just gotta think outside the box for that sort of a thing. What else did we put up here? So like a non-chemical sterilant, I talked about UV light. There's some really interesting research, which all this stuff that I'm talking about, if you have a question about a particular aspect, 9 times out of 10, I've got a research report hanging out in my Dropbox if you want me to email it to you. I didn't say this at the beginning, but that's one reason I had the email up. I'll also have a YouTube channel that I'll be putting this up on, so if you missed anything or if I didn't talk loud enough, then you'll be able to hear it that way, hopefully. So anyways, you've got your UV irradiation, which can be used for fungus control. Not just using a black light, that's more commercial. The UV aspect I mean, but like for example, exposing your plants to sunlight, allowing them to get UV radiation in that way can be helpful. A lot of insects, like scale insects, like to live on the underside of leaves, for example, and I think that's part of their adaptation. But it also keeps them from being visible from predators and other sorts of things. And then, yeah, hand killing, squishing them. Can't get more basic than that. That's probably been around for a long time. All right, I'm going to skip this because that's mostly for commercial. But IPM is really important. All right, so present and future pests. I made this slide particularly in mind for this group because even though in a commercial setting you should always be aware of the kind of pests you can get, and a lot of times you can't pay as much detail to what you're growing on an individual basis.
That's just saying that looks like the psyllid on the right.
That's
Asian citrus psyllid.
That's actually that's African citrus psyllid,
Okay.
but you're correct. That is one of those psyllids that can harbor and vector citrus greening disease, hormone green. And you got to think about that. So who knows how close any of these citrus greening disease psyllids are to San Diego? I think Ben knows. Yeah. Yeah.
80 miles?
Yeah, 80 miles. Right, exactly. So it's right on our doorstep.
I thought they found some already.
Say again.
I thought they found some in it. It's the residential areas.
They did, they have.
Oh, have they?
Yeah.
See, there you go. And that's the other thing is that that sort of information is so bleeding edge. It's so it's happening and transforming so much that I'll make this slide, then maybe 2 weeks later, oh, there's another area. Who knows what the middle insect is? Yeah, it's the spotted lanternfly because I have it up on the slide. I'm just trying to make sure that you guys are reading my slides.
You said they're 80 miles
Tell
away.
us-
Which direction? What are we talking about here?
North, I think.
Well, they probably.
Probably south too.
I don't know if they found any recently. That was a couple years ago.
Well, I feel about a year ago they found some more.
What is the characteristics of that lanternfly?
In what?
What does it do? Is it
I found one here in North.
bark or leaf or fruit or what?
Well, in Pennsylvania, so the spotted lanternfly is originally from Vietnam, but it's been found in Pennsylvania. And actually, within the last month, I've been tracking this because who knows? I'm not going to rule it out that it could potentially live or come to San Diego or some other place in the United States. On a plant, right? But the spotted lanternfly has, within the last month, been found in multiple other counties. So the quarantine efforts in Pennsylvania have not been effective enough, and it's possible that it might wind up someday in San Diego. Who knows?
What does it do?
It's like a lot of other insects, a lot of other hemipterans, so it's got a little proboscis and it'll just suck out plant juices. And it's just real pestiferous. It just, huge egg masses, tons of young. It'll lay them, and I think one of the things Pennsylvania has put out, and you can look this up online, or if you want, I can email you some of the bulletins regarding it. But they talk about if you're using firewood, don't bring it out of the state, don't bring it out of the county, use it all up. I think they've also even mentioned things like check your boats. Have you seen anything about that, Ron?
About what?
About spotted lanternfly?
No, I haven't, not off the top, but
Okay.
thanks.
I check with Ron because he knows a lot too. So if I can't help you, maybe Ron has an idea about something, but or maybe not. Maybe he doesn't want the
Can that
attention.
spread
I'm not
disease
sure.
too?
Say again?
Can that spread disease?
I don't think so.
If
Yeah,
it's
the things are lobster types.
I mean, it could, but a lot of times, like viruses and pathogens have a specific relationship with these sorts of insects. So, not off the top of my head, am I aware that it transmits disease, which might be not helpful if I put this up on YouTube and everyone says, "Of course it does." So, hopefully, I'll put that in the description of the YouTube video if that is the case. But I don't think so. I think it's just really vociferous.
Cause and effects question. We're seeing an increase in Argentine ants here in San Diego County, of course, which, as you were talking about earlier, helps protect scales, aphids, so on and so forth. Where are we getting to a tipping point with that becoming too big of a problem for home growers and even commercial growers to handle? They're like, I can't find anything that takes care of these guys.
You mean particularly for the Argentine ant?
They hate to sprinkle everywhere.
That's just terrible for us, but-
I'm not sure they'll become a problem in like a agricultural sense
No, they don't.
necessarily.
They protect the psyllids.
Well, that's true too.
So
I guess-
we were told at a meeting with the citrus board,
Oh,
if you're
okay.
growing citrus organically, you have to control the ants or you are not going to get rid of the
I see what
psyllids.
you're saying.
Because they protect the psyllids from
I was
natural
thinking-
predators.
I see. I was thinking specifically in regards to it being I thought you might meant like in a household setting or something like that. No, well, as you guys probably are aware, and for those who are not, Argentine ant is a big problem primarily because it forms super colonies. The hydrocarbons on their cuticle, which normally will let them know, are you a friend, are you a foe? They're like the IRR, or what's it, identified friend or foe? Yeah, they're like IFF sensors on military vehicles and things like that. So they'll usually, even the same species with different colonies will have something very unique. And in this case, in that case, they will attack each other if they're not from the same colony. But Argentine ants don't have that problem. So they will, at the very minimum, not interfere with each other, and the very maximum, actively help each other if they come across each other. So you've got this big old super colony across the coast of California. And it's huge. It's probably the largest contiguous amount of ants, I think, ever in the world. But don't quote me on that. You're all writing it down. But look it up. Look it up. I think that's a huge problem. You're right. And if the citrus board is talking about it, I have learned something now from this presentation, which is really helpful. I would say that if you're going to control them, I suppose you could use a bunch of different things. Ant bait comes to mind, like fipronil, which is relatively safe, but you've also got other options like Beauveria bassiana, which is a entomopathogenic fungus that you could spray if you find them. The thing about ants, though, is that you want something that, because if you just kill the workers, you just got a temporary solution. You need to kill the nest. And in some cases, the honest truth is that you might not be able to kill the nest because it's outside your property. You just can't go outside. So sometimes you kind of have no option. But if it is on your property, Beauveria bassiana is one way. You could dump boiling water down the nest, like do whatever you can to control that. But a lot of times you don't have that option because the nest is simply not on your property, unfortunately.
Yeah, an interesting article about the fire ants and the Argentine ants. They
Okay.
fight each other, and by sheer numbers, the Argentine ants can eliminate some outbreaks.
That makes sense. Another arthropod that's kind of like that, you've got two sort of pest organisms like that is the black widow and the brown widow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so who knows what those are? Well, yeah. So brown widows are actually less venomous and they outcompete black widows, but they're still venomous and they still can bite you. But like that's kind of an interesting thing is that the less venomous, less problematic organism is outcompeting the black widow, which is kind of nice. So it's the devil you don't know of the devil that you do know.
Well, a couple of things. I know there's other hands, I'm sorry. One thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Argentine ant has tends to raid pots, minor pots, and if I got my ID down correct, I've had pots raided and they've moved nymphs and subadults into planter pots in less than 30 minutes. To
I-
where it's just completely moving them indoors, and I have already a seed colony that transports, and that's one way that they're actually being moved around the country. If I got my ID.
You mean the ants?
The ants themselves will then seed colony pots and planters, and so nurseries are a means of distribution for the colonies.
You know, I hadn't heard that, so I can't.
Well, we got nods right here from the man.
Yeah, I can't correct you on that, but if that's the case, that's a big
They do it
deal.
immediately, nice warm pot, whatever it may be. they
Oh,
move
sorry
right
about
in.
that.
And I've
Can you
seen
project your
very
voice so
nymphs
people in the
and-
front can't hear you?
Sorry, I've seen them move nymphs and subadults right into a pot within 30 minutes and just seed colony the pot. So if you're a nursery or if you're moving pots around, I've had them come in from other people that I've traded plants with. But if you're trading out, you may have a colony of Argentine ants in that pot. And that's how they're being distributed throughout the region and country.
You know,
So be careful about that.
you know
Be aware.
that's not totally surprising because I think that Argentine ant, one of the other things that makes it sort of difficult to deal with is that it's, I think it's polygynous. So there's a lot of different, there's multiple queens, not just one queen.
Absolutely, yeah, that's,
It's very easy for one queen to kind of travel with a contingent or just happen to be there during swarming or whatever and get into a pot and then you move it out and there you
that's
go.
exactly what they do. I've watched it happen.
Well then,
So,
I
yeah.
won't invalidate your personal observation.
One thing I had a big problem with the Argentine ants with my raised plant beds like that, and my plumerias. I have a lot of planted plumerias. It's an old club I had to be in. And so what I did is I got chalk dust and went around the edges of all the potted plants and the raised plant beds because the chalk gets into the exoskeleton and they pretty much freeze up and die. And that was a very friendly way, you know, that I really, it almost got rid of all my ants that I had any problems with.
I've heard of
Chocolate?
what?
Chalk dust.
Chalk dust, you said.
Oh.
Chalk dust.
What's good on the ants is Windex.
Oh, good.
That's what they say.
It does, you put Windex on there, the ants.
I've heard a similar sort of thing with diatomaceous earth. I don't know if chalk. I don't know if some chalk is diatomaceous earth.
I'm sure it is.
Perhaps that's what. Perhaps it's you know. Yeah, that's actually a good point. That's an excellent point. Diatomaceous earth.
Kitty litter, basically. Most kitty litter is made of diatomaceous earth.
I don't own cats. Actually.
Okay.
I don't know if that's.
Grade one, that's one you figured it
Oh, I see. You want to use food grade, is what I'm being
Yeah,
told
food
here.
grade, yeah.
That makes sense, of course. But yeah, the diatomaceous earth, diatomaceous earth gets that name because it's made out of diatoms, which are these little small organisms that have a silicon or a silicate exoskeleton, and you know, they're like glass. So like at a very small level, you know, something with an exoskeleton walks in, it's like being in a suit of armor and then walking through a field of like jagged glass, and if it gets right into your joints, it's not fun, I imagine.
So I've heard many good things about fipronil for controlling the Argentine ants and about spraying like a lime mixture
Okay.
around, but you said there was a biological control as well? Like a type of pest that preys on them?
I actually didn't say that. I want to make sure that I'm projecting my voice too. I do have. I mentioned a fungus. Yeah, Beauveria bassiana. Beauveria bassiana is a entomopathogenic fungus. By the way, how are we doing on time? Good. Cool. I love to talk. Beauveria bassiana, you can buy that as a product called Botanigard or Mycotrol, like control, Mycotrol. And I really love that stuff. I really love entomopathogenic fungi in general as a biological control. And Botanigard has a strain called Beauveria bassiana GHA, which stands for grasshopper active. Back in the early 90s is when it was isolated, and through a re-isolation process, getting it to work on grasshoppers, they were able to make it be specialized like a strain and isolate specifically good and geared towards grasshoppers. But it's also very well for tons of other insects. You look at that label and there's just a bunch of list, a huge list of pests that it can kill. So I would recommend that. Also, how many people here know who Paul Stamets is? Okay, so Paul Stamets, wow, I'm really surprised actually. Paul Stamets is a mycologist. He has developed some patents regarding the use of I guess the way I would put it is a non-sporulating form of different fungi from the cordyceps. Who knows what a cordyceps fungus? Yeah, Ron over there. Cordyceps fungi are those fungi that get into ants you might have seen on the Discovery Channel, and then they mess with their brains, but actually like a marionette they found that they actually control how they're walking, and they'll give them to, travel to someplace high, and then the fruiting body comes out, the spores will come out, and it's real nasty stuff. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy to die that way, but yeah, so these are kind of similar. And I think Paul has patented some sort of thing regarding that. I don't know if he's actually come out with a product, but it's like a non-sporulating form of fungus for ants specifically to come in and take the grain spawn and take it back to their hive. And when they eat it, it gets into their body, and then it mycosizes their body. It infects them and kills them from the inside out. Real gruesome, real effective. I've kind of gotten way off topic here. I just want to touch on the Chilean false spider mite. So mites, flat mites in this genus, Brevipalpus, there are some that transmit citrus disease. There's a virus called, I want to say it's called Citrus C or Citrus L. Citrus C disease is the only one in its own genus, not the living organisms, but and that's in South America, and it could come up here. It could come up here at some point. So just be aware that just because you might think it's under control and you're not seeing any pests and everything's going to be fine, it might not be fine forever. And with the USDA and other organizations regarding agriculture being defunded, you might have less support. And I am not happy about that, but that's the reality we live in, and we need to consider that moving forward.
Well, look at how much fruit and stuff is coming up from Chile and all down there.
Sure. There might also be different regulations. There might not be, there may be some pesticides in there that we're not aware of too. Not that I'm trying to badmouth an entire agricultural sector, and I don't have any bias, I'm sure, but that's something to consider too, is that they might not be checked as much because of that defunding and things like that.
For sandmite, we didn't have until.
Oh, sandmite, yes, there you go.
Sandmites, for there
Right.
are two major insects that we never had, but the industry has really had a long time because they were allowed to come up in shipments of avocados.
That's an excellent example. All right, so I got some examples here that I wanted to touch on. A lot of these are really small. You'd have to have a microscope to look at them, but I just wanted to go over them in case you take a pest to an extension person and they say, oh, this is what it is, and you don't know you have no idea what it is because you're not a taxonomist. Yeah?
Okay, so when you take something to the extension office, do you recommend putting it in a plastic bag, a paper bag? What is your recommendation for how someone should take a sample to the extension office if they want to do that?
Sure. Definitely put it in an enclosure. It depends on the bug, but generally speaking, I would say that it's hard. If you've got like a mite, I mean, if you can get that into like a tube or something, or like a little vial or something, that'd be really helpful. But a lot of people don't walk around with tubes like I do for collecting bugs, which is an occupational hazard. But if you have like a plastic bag, like the gentleman who brought me the scale insect, just put it in a plastic bag. Do your best. 9 times out of 10, it won't be the only pest on your plant, so you could probably come back if you killed it on the way to on the way to showing the officer. Yeah.
You mentioned microscope. Is that a stereo microscope, or are you using a compound microscope when you're looking at the mites?
I would definitely recommend an observational microscope. I have a non-observational microscope at home, and it's hard to use it appropriately for that kind of thing. Definitely, if you can, if you're the type of person who wants to get a microscope and look at these pests, I would get an observational, what's called an observational microscope, and a stereo one at that. Okay. Stereoscope. So yeah, put it in a plastic bag. Put a leaf sample or something like that in there. If you want to get fancy and advanced, get a vial, get alcohol, ethanol, real high proof sort of thing, and try to put like the leaf or try to get the mite in there if you can see it. Yes, Ron?
Can you use isopropyl? Like 90% isopropyl alcohol for your preservation?
I would say yes.
Because that's real easy off the shelf.
There you go. It's not like going to be your perfect thing, but I think for this sort of a thing, I think it would work fine.
Thank you.
Definitely. No problem. I appreciate the suggestion actually, and I appreciate everyone who's been suggesting things, because I learned something today too, and I really appreciate it. So thanks a lot for everyone who's suggesting and asking questions.
I'm so thankful that the county comes around and puts out pheromone and other traps.
There you go.
Because it gives me a clean bill of health, and I'm glad to know if I've got bad pests on my property.
It's really helpful, and I
They
think
do it. They've been doing it every year, and they've got about 8 of them out there right now, and I'm thankful that they're there.
I know a few people who really resent that.
I know there are.
But I think it's really important for our community health, our community fruit growing health. And I'm sure all of you would be very resentful if a pest got into somebody's tree, and because they decided not to have somebody come around and get a trap, that now you've got that and it jumps into somebody else's crop and that sort of thing. So you've got, I have four families of mites up here. You've got your Tetranychidae, which are your spider mites, if you've ever heard that term. Generally speaking, the term spider mite refers to tetranychids. You've got the Tenui palpidae, which are your flat mites, also called false spider mites, because unlike spider mites, they don't spin silk. But they are mites, so that's where they get the name from. Your tarsinemids, so if you ever heard the term broad mites and cyclamen mites or tarsinemid mites, they're very small oval mites, really, really tiny. The name for the broad mite is Polyphagotarsinemus latus. Polyphago means eats a lot of different things. So, and that's really, think that there's like 200 different crop species that it can infest. So like, yeah, and some of the, and that's just crop species. That doesn't include other things like weeds. So if you don't weed, you might have a residue.